Hi again. One of the things that we've been touching on in this module is that there's actually a fair amount of variability in who it is that's out there walking and biking, and therefore a fair amount of variability in who planners need to keep in mind when they're planning pedestrian and bicyclist infrastructure. There's also a fair amount of room for broadening who walks and bikes, making walking and biking more appealing, safer, just a more realistic option for a wider variety of people. And that's also a really important facet of bicycle and pedestrian planning, is figuring out how to broaden the base of users. So let's think a little bit about who walks and bikes currently in the US. One thing to note is that there is a pretty substantial gender gap, particularly among bicyclists. So whereas about 51% of the US population is female, and among walking trips, about 51% are made by female walkers. With bicycling, only about 24% of bike trips are made by females, which suggests that there's just this extreme bias toward men in cycling. And so a really important focus in bicycle planning is figuring out how to make bicycling more appealing or accessible to women. Looking at age, whereas about 21% of the US population is under the age of 16, only about 17% of walking trips are made by people under 16. So walking seems to be underutilized by youth, and therefore a focus for planning might be how to get more youth interested or able to walk to where they need to go. Biking, by contrast, is fairly overrepresented by youth. So about 40% of biking trips are made by people under the age of 16. And so this suggests that bicycle planning needs to be oriented toward further involving the adult population. And particular, if we look at the graph on the far right, you see that while 14% of the US population is 65 and older, only about 6% of bike trips are made by people age 65 and older. And so there's a lot of work to be done to make bicycling something that is accessible to an older generation. Another important demographic dimension to look at is income. So whereas 17% of US households are considered low income, 21% of US walking trips are made by people within low-income households. And so this suggests that walking is really important to low-income populations, and that planners need to focus attention on ensuring that communities that are relatively low-income have good access to walking infrastructure and land uses that enable walking, that put common destinations within walkable distances. On the other hand, only about 13% of bike trips are made by people within low-income households, which suggests that there's a lot of potential to increase the role of bicycling for low-income individuals, for whom bicycling might offer a really important alternative to more expensive modes like private autos or transit. You can compare that to a disproportionately large use of transit by low-income individuals. 35% of US transit trips are made by people from low-income households. And this really points to the possibility of some land use issues related to where low-income individuals live. If folks who are low-income need to travel far distances that might require transit, for example, as opposed to active alternatives like walking and biking, then they may be forced to use these more expensive modes. Perhaps planning low-income communities so that walking and biking are more viable alternatives would reduce some dependency on more expensive modes like transit. An important part of bicycle planning is thinking about who users are, what their needs are in terms of physical infrastructure, but also what their values are, what different users might be advocating for, what sorts of changes they might need on a cultural level in order to be more interested in cycling, in order to make it a more viable and popular mode. Road cyclists, who we might call roadies, or sometimes humorously referred to as mammals, middle-aged men in lycra, have a very particular stake in cycling. This has been a pretty dominant mode of cycling within the United States, but it really has a very particular and very narrow perspective on what cycling could or should be, and some really different infrastructure requirements than many other user groups. So roadies might be, very comfortable riding with traffic traffic, maybe having roads that don't have very much traffic on them, but, don't want or need something like a bicycle lane. In a lot of cases, folks within a user group like this might actually right outside of a bike lane if a bike lane is installed, and might even advocate against bike lanes. By contrast, a user group that we might call townies that are, much more interested in using a bicycle to get around town, maybe traveling at a lower speed, and are interested in how a bike can sort of fit into their daily lives, running errands, being used to commute, etc. And this user group has a lot of interest in developing infrastructure that's separated from traffic, that might move a bit slower, and is probably very safety oriented, with an interest in getting kids, the whole family, out on bikes and using bikes as a viable means for daily transportation, but also kind of casual recreation. Another stakeholder group is what we could call an urban cyclist. Maybe the bike messenger fits into this category. And again, this is a user group that might have more interest in riding in traffic as opposed to having a separated facility. There's also a really important and beneficial culture around urban cyclists who have in many ways normalized bikes as part of the urban transportation scene and something that's desirable on a cultural level. And then another way that bicycle planners are increasingly defining an important user group, or a breadth of users actually, has to do with planning for people from 8 to 80. And this describes rough ages. So saying, we need to design facilities that are comfortable for children, maybe at the age of 8, all the way up to older adults who are, 80 years old, so that these places are welcoming to this incredible range of people, rather than necessarily targeting one user group or the other. So while bicycle planners have done an increasingly good job of considering the breadth of different users that they need to account for, I think that one user group actually does get persistently overlooked, and that has to do with low-income commuters, for whom using a bicycle is maybe more of a necessity than a choice. And while, as we look back here, there's a fairly small proportion of current bicycle users who are described as low income, I think that the low-income commuter is a really crucial part of extending bicycle planning so that it's more inclusive. And so there's an emerging emphasis in bicycle planning on reaching out to communities that might substantially benefit from having better bicycle infrastructure as an alternative to more expensive modes.